Hi, my name's Andy Lazur. I'm a water quality specialist with the University of Maryland Extension, and I will be discussing the latest on PFAS compounds and how to protect yourself and your family. The University of Maryland Extension is funded in part by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and this is a notice to inform you that our programming is open to all. So what I'll be discussing is a little bit about PFAS compounds, what they are, what makes them so unique, and also of high risk. I'll talk about the sources of PFAS, then get into the health risks associated with exposure, and then how can we individually reduce our exposure to PFAS. So PFAS compounds, also known as polyfluoroalkyl substances, have been dubbed the term forever chemicals. And the reason for this is because of their very strong persistence in the environment. And that is due primarily to this carbon-fluorine bond, which is one of the strongest in nature. So it's very hard to break this bond. There are at least 15,000 of PFAS compounds, and the production of these started in the 1940s with a common product known as Teflon, and then it evolved to nonstick cookware, stain-free carpets, etc. But PFAS compounds are used in hundreds and hundreds of products. You can see here, firefighting foam is a big point source of PFAS compounds, but they're found in cosmetics, our food packaging, mining, electronics, pesticides, guitar strings, even dental floss. And they have been found in air and raindrops around the world, and also in our ground and surface waters and our soil. So the chemical structure of these 15,000 compounds varies greatly. We have long and short chain PFAS compounds, and then we have different chemical makeup characteristics, these various groups that are attached to the carbon fluorine make up different characteristics. PFOS and PFOA are the two most common PFAS compounds, also the most studied. But again, with 15,000 compounds, you can imagine the variety and the different chemical makeup. So we have what's called non-polymers and polymers. The non-polymers tend to be the smaller ones. These are more easily absorbed by humans and therefore are considered to be more harmful. The polymers, again, these are the longer chain compounds. Again, these different chemical formulas provide different characteristics to the compound. But what happens with these polymers, they can actually break down into smaller molecules that are harmful. So PFAS compounds can enter the environment in many ways, depending upon the sources, airports, wastewater treatment plants, some cases biosolids that are applied to the land, industrial waste. It gets into the atmosphere. It can rain down. It can get into our waterways, get into our soils, it's taken up by plants, taken up by animals. So unfortunately, there's this large connectivity of PFAS compounds in our environment. As far as exposure to humans, again, primary sources are drinking water, our foods, for example, possibly skin contact, but then it's also been shown to be transferred from mothers to infants through the breast milk and the cord blood. So again, once it's in the body, it can be transmitted. Again, the history goes back to the 40s, and you can see this timeline here showing it took about almost 30 years to identify that there were some potential human health risks associated with PFAS compounds. And then since then, a lot more studies finding issues with cancer, et cetera, which we'll talk about in a minute. But then also you're looking at some policies to try to phase out the two more common ones, the PFOA and the PFOS. But then there is, again, new compounds being produced. This also is showing in the 2010 and more recent and numerous lawsuits associated with PFAS compounds. So why are we concerned? We do know that they're toxic to humans. They're very persistent. They're passed along the food chain in aquatic systems as well as land-based systems. These are very prevalent. They're used in a lot of different products. Most of us have been exposed to it. EPA in 2016 developed health advisories for PFOA and PFAS, and recently they've reduced the maximum contaminant level from 70 parts per trillion to 4, and that's going to be implemented in 2031. So additional things, again, PFOA and PFAS, they can cause different types of cancer, impact our cholesterol levels, can result in low infant birth weights, also changes in our hormone function and decreased fertility, impacting our thyroid. Again, newborn babies could be at increased risk. Some of the cancers that have been observed include prostate and ovarian cancer, testicular and kidney cancer. Studies have shown that most people have PFAS in their blood, particularly, but it has been found in other body tissue, including the lungs, kidney, liver, brain, and bones. And again, diet and water are significant sources of PFAS. So what's interesting here is when PFOA and PFAS were phased out around 2000, you can actually see blood levels decreasing. So this is actually good news. But again, remember that we're also exposed to potentially thousands of other PFAS compounds in the various products that we use, but then that also break down and then get into our water and our soils. So what's interesting about PFAS compounds is they're very persistent in the environment, but they're very persistent in our bodies. And so this table is showing what's called the half-life of PFAS. And so basically the half-life means the length of time it takes for half of that contaminant to be eliminated from our bodies. And you can see here that these compounds can last, up to 10 or so years. So half of the PFOA that I was exposed to 10 years ago could be eliminated, but then I've also been daily exposed to PFAS compounds. Unfortunately, these concentrations can actually build up. We have found it in all sorts of different watersheds. You can see in particular those areas that are near industrial sites, airport training areas, for example, military bases, public certified airports, and wastewater treatment plants are what's called point sources, major sources of these compounds. We've also seen it in lots of different public utilities, water utilities, at some pretty high concentrations. You can see here as high as 1,800 parts per trillion, and the new EPA advisory is down to 4. So some of these areas have been contaminated at very high levels. So again, EPA has initiated some recent rulings. So in 2031, public water utilities will be required to treat PFOA and PFAS down to 4 parts per trillion. The good news about that is that in treating for PFOA and PFAS, the technologies that they will use will also help treat other PFAS compounds. So when we look at treatment of PFAS, there are a number of treatments used in public water plants, but those have been shown to be ineffective. What is effective are existing filters, activated carbon, reverse osmosis, and ion exchange. Very effective in removing PFAS compounds. And these 3 can actually be purchased for homes, either treating the entire volume of your water or what's called a point of use. That would be, say, a kitchen faucet could be filtered and be very effective in treatment of PFAS. Again, PFAS has been shown to be in the soil, and then plants take that up. This is just showing some different levels of different types of vegetables, for example. And then it's also in our waters, and therefore it's picked up by our fish, both freshwater and marine. You may have heard about some in the news, some about issues on farms associated with PFAS compounds. And that is primarily with the use of biosolids. These are the kind of the dried solids from a wastewater treatment plant. It's important to note, however, that there are different types of biosolids. There's industrial, such as a paper mill, and then there is the wastewater treatment type of biosolids. Some of the industrial types have very high concentrations of PFAS compounds and have actually been the culprit in some of the farms being contaminated. Though biosolids is a source, and many states have adopted recommended application rates to minimize the buildup of PFAS compounds. But it is used, widely in a lot of areas. You can see at least half of the wastewater biosolids are used in land application. The other important thing to note about PFAS is there's a lot of research going on, not only about the human health aspects, environmental health aspects, but also how do we remove or how do we destroy PFAS compounds. So again, lots of research in different types of techniques or processes. You just can't burn a PFAS compound in a regular fire, because what happens is it just changes from a solid state into a gaseous state, and it's now in the air. So it takes a lot more involved. And again, there's advantages and disadvantages of these different types of technologies. But again, the research is continuing on this, and so they're learning more and more about that. So what are some of the takeaways? Again, numerous compounds. Only a handful or so have been really studied in depth. So therefore, the total concentration of PFAS compounds could be greater, especially if they're only testing, say, for a dozen or 2 or 3 dozen compounds. What about the other tens of thousands that are out there? So again, this type of research is expensive, and the technologies actually to analyze PFAS compounds is limited to a smaller subset of these products. Again, it's found in thousands of products in our air, our dust, our soils, plants, and they're very persistent because of that carbon-fluorine bond. And again, some of these can actually break down into another product, TFA, trifluoroacetic acid. And so more research is being done on that particular compound. We find it in our waters, streams, rivers, oceans, and our groundwater. And again, what can happen is that continual exposure can actually lead to what's called bioaccumulation of these contaminants within certain types of tissues, including animal and human tissue. Most of us have it in our blood because of the long-term exposure to many, many products that are used. And again, cancers, immune system issues, these are important health risks associated with PFAS. And again, fortunately, there's a lot of research going on to learn more and more about this. Remediation is being studied, and water treatment is probably the best understood. And we have existing filter technology to do a very effective job in removing the majority of PFAS. EPA has been active and again has implemented this reduction of maximum PFOA and PFAS concentrations down to 4 parts per trillion beginning in 2031. Numerous lawsuits have been filed against these compounds, and again, the destruction technology is advancing. And that's the good news. If you want to find some good news about PFAS compounds, is that this research is teaching us a lot about the risks, but also future ways and how we could reduce not only our exposure, but also reduce the concentrations throughout the environment. So what can you do personally? If you're on a public utility, check with them about their PFAS treatment and levels. Each public utility is required by the EPA to inform their customers annually with what's called a Consumer Confidence Report. And oftentimes those reports will mention PFAS compounds, but you can contact the utility to get more information about PFAS levels. If you're on a well and you happen to be located near some of these contamination point sources, such as an airport or wastewater treatment plant or industry, recommend that you check with your local health department and ask about how to have your water tested. There are numerous PFAS-free products online. Check those out. Recycling our waste is very important. Follow through with your local recycling for various products. That can help reduce the amount that's getting into the environment. Also note that many states now have fish advisories, particularly for those areas that are exposed to point sources of PFAS. Try to avoid non-stick cookware. And if you're shopping for cookware, be aware of some marketing strategies that will state it is one compound free, but may not be free of other PFAS. And then if you do use non-stick cookware, be sure that you cook at lower heats and do not scrape or scratch the surface. PFAS is in a lot of food packaging. It's not labeled, but if you're concerned about a particular product, contact the company. And then if you're putting a filter on your water supply, be sure you purchase what's termed a third-party verified filter. That could be activated carbon, ion exchange, or reverse osmosis. The third-party certification basically verifies that what is on the label as far as percent reduction is what they found in their studies. And then again, we all can become aware of the various types of products that contain PFAS and try to avoid these. So there's a wealth of information from a lot of different resources locally in your state, the CDC, EPA. I encourage you to take a look at that information and become better informed. So thank you.